Welcome back to our channel, where forgotten history comes back to life. Today we're diving into a tale that's darker and more disturbing than legend admits. You may know the name William Wallace, but what really happened to him will shock you more than any movie ever could. Let's uncover the truth behind one of the most brutal executions in medieval history. A heavy fog wrapped around London Bridge that morning. Above the street, decaying heads on spikes silently glared down. Their empty eyes had witnessed many horrors, but none like the one they were about to see. It was August 23rd, 1305, a day when death would take a new brutal shape. England's most infamous prisoner was pulled through the streets. His final journey had begun, one soaked in cruelty and rage. This wasn't simply about ending a life. It was about crushing a symbol of hope. William Wallace had once been Scotland's fearless champion, a knight from humble roots who united clans and shocked empires. He had defeated massive English forces despite being outnumbered, but now everything had been stripped away: clothes, pride, freedom. Tied to a wooden frame, Wallace lay exposed, ready to face the terrifying promise King Edward had made. This was no movie version of events. This was the cold recorded truth, a truth far more disturbing than any tale from Hollywood. A truth where justice meant torment, not fairness. What happened to Wallace was not random cruelty. It was a carefully crafted message sent through blood. Executions in those times were public theater. They aimed to terrify more than to punish, and Wallace's death, it would be the crown jewel of this gruesome art. By the end, you'll understand why soldiers were sickened, why mothers screamed too late, and why this story still haunts. But here's something most people miss. Wallace wasn't meant to end up like this. Just 8 years before, he had no fame. He was just a landowner's son living a quiet life. That all changed the day the English came. Something happened that turned peace into fury. That one day lit a fire that birthed a warrior. A warrior so feared he became a legend. But Edward, known as the Ram, wouldn't allow it. He would turn Wallace into a warning. The road to his capture was paved with betrayal, with English bribes and Scottish blood spilled in shadows. By 1305, most Scottish nobles had surrendered. They gave up their country to protect their wealth. But Wallace, the stubborn fighter, still roamed free. He never bowed to any English king. To those who gave up his presence was shameful. He reminded them of what they'd lost. Edward's spies were everywhere in Scotland. You couldn't trust a merchant, a priest, or even a friend. A reward of £30 was placed on his head, enough to buy land and risk a man's soul. Anyone caught helping Wallace faced death too. Fear was spreading and trust was fading fast. His circle of allies shrank with every passing day. And then came the final, inevitable betrayal. Sir John Meneth had once stood beside him, but after swearing a loyalty to Edward, he turned traitor. Some believe a servant Jack Short played a role. If true, the betrayal reached deep into Wallace's home. The details were buried, likely on purpose. But on August 5th, 1305, near Glasgow, the trap was sprung. Wallace walked into it unknowing. Perhaps he thought he was safe among friends. He might have been tired, worn down by years on the run. And then suddenly, familiar faces turned against him. The records don't say how he reacted, but they all agree he was captured alive. Maybe he froze in disbelief. Or maybe he chose not to die just yet. He may have hoped for justice from Scottish law. But what came next destroyed that hope completely. The trip to London was its own punishment. Wallace was dragged through towns like a caged beast, chained, locked in an iron box. A display meant to spark hate and fear. Crowds came to stare at the Scottish demon. Children hurled stones. Women spat in disgust. Men shouted at him, though they'd never seen war. The hero who once terrified armies could not fight back. But the worst pain wasn't from their abuse. It was the knowledge of what was waiting at the end. Wallace knew English justice, and he knew it would be no mercy. He understood what happened to traitors. During those long days on the road, the dread only grew. Wallace had time to imagine every terrible detail, and King Edward made sure his fears stayed alive. Edward was a master of fear and manipulation. He gave Wallace's imagination plenty to feed on. London in August was a city of filth and fire. Rotten fish and sewage clung to the hot, narrow streets. When Wallace arrived on August 22nd, the city stirred. Crowds swarmed the roads to see the captured warrior. The records say it wasn't mere curiosity. It was bloodlust stirred up by royal lies. Wallace spent that night in Fenwick Street, held in the home of a man named William Deere. Can you picture that night in his cell? Knowing dawn would bring not just death, but total destruction. His body wouldn't just die, it would be scattered, broken into pieces, and shipped to every kingdom. Guards claimed they heard him whispering prayers. No one knows if he asked for rescue or strength. But when the sun rose the next day, he was ready. Whatever waited, Wallace would face it head on. The trip to Westminster Hall wasn't simple transport. It was a twisted celebration of Edward's triumph. Wallace wasn't thrown in a wagon like a thief. He was placed on horseback and paraded with ceremony. The mayor, sheriffs, knights all surrounded him, not to protect, but to humiliate and display. It wasn't justice, it was theater. A show meant to crush hope and raise fear. Edward wanted every soul in London to witness it, to see the great Wallace brought down in chains. Westminster Hall was enormous, almost beast-like. Its towering beams loomed above the crowd like ribs. That morning it was overflowing with spectators. Many had paid handsomely for the best view. At the south end stood a wooden stage, tall enough so no one would miss the spectacle. And then came the cruelest insult of all. As Wallace climbed the platform, they crowned him, not with honor, but mockery, a laurel wreath, a jab at a claim he may never have made. They said he once claimed the right to a crown, but truth didn't matter, Edward's version did. The wreath wasn't for pride, it was for shame, a silent joke at the cost of a nation's pride. To them, Wallace wasn't a hero anymore. He was a warning dressed up in irony. 5 judges robed in scarlet waited above, each one handpicked by Edward himself. They were not fair or neutral. They were chosen to deliver the sentence already written. Sir Peter Mallory, the king's lead justice, stood. The hall grew silent for the reading of charges. He listed Wallace's supposed crimes in full: treason, murder, arson, theft, each word louder than the last. They recounted his raids, his battles, his burns, even claimed he spared no one, not women or clergy. They painted him as a bloodthirsty monster, a beast, not a man. But here's the strange twist in it all. Under English law, Wallace couldn't be guilty of treason. Treason means betraying your ruler. But Wallace had never sworn loyalty to Edward. He fought for Scotland, for its freedom, not for any English king. So they made up something worse. They claimed Wallace wanted to crown himself king. It was a lie, but a useful one that gave them legal grounds for what came next. When asked to respond, Wallace was allowed a few words. And what he said echoed defiance to the end. "I cannot be a traitor," he declared boldly, "for I never gave him my loyalty. He is not my king. He never received my oath and never will." Think of the courage that took in that moment. Mocked, surrounded, doomed, yet he stood firm. No begging, no pleading, just truth held like a sword to the end. To Wallace, Scotland was its own nation, and Edward had no right to rule it or judge him. But the court cared nothing for his truth. They silenced him immediately by law. As an outlaw, he had no right to speak. His defiance was ignored, his sentence already decided. The judgment came down without delay, and it was worse than death. For treason, he would be dragged through the streets. For murder and theft, he would be hanged. For burning churches and killing clergy, he would be gutted and his insides burned before him. For everything combined, he would be beheaded. Then his body cut into 4 parts. Each piece would be sent to a different city. A message carved in flesh to all who dared rebel. This wasn't punishment. It was a ritual to erase a man from memory. Every part of the punishment was chosen with care. Not for justice, but for pain and shame. Being dragged would weaken him before it even began. The hanging would hurt without granting release. The disembowelment would cause unspeakable agony, and the quartering would erase him even in death. No grave, no peace, no body left whole. Nothing for his followers to mourn or remember. But what came next was even worse, because the sentence wasn't just cruel, it was real. Within hours, the execution began. And Wallace would meet the masters of medieval torment. These men didn't just kill. They crafted pain like sculptors shape stone. As soon as the court adjourned, it started. Guards grabbed Wallace and tore off his clothes. A final insult for a warrior once feared by kings. He was now naked, exposed to both wind and eyes. They tied him to a hurdle, a wooden frame, designed not to carry, but to destroy. The body lay face down, ropes digging into flesh. Arms pulled, wide legs bound tight at the ends. Some say they placed a beam under his chest, so his head wouldn't knock out too soon. The hurdle kept him conscious longer, so he could feel every inch of punishment. The path wasn't direct. It was chosen for its crowds, not its speed. From Westminster to Smithfield was 4 long miles, through London's busiest, loudest, dirtiest streets. Edward wanted all of London to see, to watch the mighty Wallace dragged like roadkill. The horses moved slowly, pulling the frame. The pace let crowds gather and pain build. At first, his skin peeled in small patches, just scrapes sharp and stinging. But soon those scrapes became deep wounds, layers of skin torn open, exposing raw muscle. The London cobblestones were rough and filthy. They bit into flesh with every jolt and bump. Witnesses spoke of the trail left behind, a widening smear of blood that marked his route. People followed the scene with twisted excitement. Some threw filth, others just stared in silence. Rotten food stones, even animal corpses were hurled. Each impact, another wound, another drop of dignity lost. No guard stopped them. This humiliation was part of the plan. It wasn't just an execution. It was a performance with a screaming audience. Wallace was no longer a man to them. He was a symbol being dismantled before their eyes. But here's the truth the legends ignore. The body, even when broken, fights to stay awake. Wallace didn't pass out. He stayed conscious, suffering every inch of the way. Some said he whispered prayers the whole time. His lips moved, though no one heard the words. The Llanos Chronicle claims he recited psalms, maybe to himself or maybe to something higher. Every rock that slammed into him he felt. His body throbbed with damage, but he endured. Dragging him served more than transport. It drained his strength, both physical and spiritual. It stripped away any last shred of dignity. He was no longer a man, just a bleeding mass. It fed the crowd's hunger for punishment. Let them feel like they helped crush a legend. By the time they reached Smithfield, he was barely whole. His back and hips were scraped to the bone. People swore they could see white through the wounds. Not just muscle, but the core beneath. His face had hit the road over and over. The beam helped, but it didn't save him. His teeth were broken, his nose shattered. One eye swollen shut, his mouth still whispering. And yet he was still breathing, still aware, still waiting for the worst. Smithfield had long been London's ground of death, a place soaked in centuries of blood and screams. On that day it became a grim festival, the horror masked by meat pies and laughter. Vendors shouted, children played, and parents smiled as if watching a man die was a holiday event. Wealthy guests sat in wooden stands. They had paid to witness a legend fall. The scaffold rose high like a grand stage, built so none would miss the grisly show. Wallace was about to become the main performance, the final act in a deadly political play. The executioner was no beginner. He was likely John Mahlon London's state butcher. This was work for the trained and ruthless, a job that demanded precision and pain. Mahlon wore a black hood not to hide, but to mark the ritual of royal vengeance. His assistants worked like surgeons preparing for war. Blades gleamed, ropes were tightened, coals burned bright. Everything had its place, its purpose. Every item designed to bring agony, not peace. Wallace was dragged onto the platform. His torn skin left smears of blood behind him. The crowd roared, then fell silent. The moment they had waited for was here. The man who once frightened Edward himself was now nothing but flesh on a stage. The gallows looked crude, just wood and rope, but its design promised slow, strangling death. This wasn't meant to break the neck. It was made to squeeze life inch by inch. The noose was placed behind his ear to ensure he suffocated slowly, not swiftly. Two men pulled the rope with steady force, lifting Wallace barely above the floor. His feet dangled, his hands twitched. The awful dance of the hanging had begun. His face turned red, then purple with strain. Blood vessels burst his tongue, blackened and swelled. Foam, thick and red, bubbled from his mouth. One eye bulged grotesquely, the other oozed blood. The executioner watched like a conductor at work, carefully measuring the time between life and death. Too long and Wallace would die too soon. Too short, and he'd recover before the next horror. After about 3 long minutes, the rope was released. Wallace dropped like a rag doll onto the wooden boards. He didn't move at first. Some thought it was over. Then came the gasps, wet and choking. His crushed throat fought to pull in air, like a fish flailing on dry land. Blood sprayed from his mouth as he writhed. Every breath a battle he barely won. This was the true goal. Not death, but fear. To make him die again and again. While he gasped, the assistants moved quickly, dragging him to the next station of torment. A special table stood ready, made for this act. Wood and iron built to pin down a man. They stretched him wide, arms and legs bound tight. The shackles bit into flesh, already torn apart. The table tilted just enough for the crowd to see. No one could look away from what came next. A strap held his head, still eyes forward, forced to watch what they would do to him. Even in a world of public executions, what followed stirred unease in the blood-hungry crowd. The executioner approached with a narrow blade, sharp enough to slice with almost no force. He made the first cut near Wallace's groin, a clean slice that opened flesh and fat. Blood spilled instantly, warm and dark. It flowed down his legs in steady streams. The audience leaned closer, some thrilled, some pale, some already regretting ever coming near. Then came the most degrading step, the removal of his manhood. It wasn't done in one quick slash. It was done in cruel, deliberate stages, each movement designed to hurt, not kill, to prolong pain, not end it. The testicles were cut first with care, held up for all to see, then tossed into the fire. The air turned thick with horror. The scent of burning flesh made people gag. Several spectators covered their faces. Others stumbled back, sickened and pale. Then came the next cruel step. Wallace's penis was slowly removed. Every movement was done with care, not to ease pain, but to increase it. His screams echoed across Smithfield like sirens. But this was only the beginning. The true nightmare was yet to come. The executioner now turned to his abdomen. With the same sharp, narrow blade, he sliced from sternum to lower belly. It was a careful, practiced incision, deep enough to open, but not to kill. He avoided major arteries with great precision. This demanded the hand of a master torturer. Too deep, and death would come fast. Too shallow, and the organs stayed hidden. But this executioner had done it before. His skill kept Wallace teetering between life and death. He peeled back layers of flesh and muscle and opened the body like a broken shell. Inside, the organs pulsed in the sunlight, a sight never meant for human eyes. The crowd gasped as they stared in. Some turned away, others leaned even closer. For a moment, Smithfield became a dark anatomy lesson, a public theater of blood and bone. Wallace incredibly remained awake, his head tilted just enough to see. He saw his own body opened wide, his life now scattered across wooden boards. The executioner reached inside without hesitation, his hands disappearing into the warm cavity. He found the small intestine first, over 20 feet of it coiled inside. He began to pull slowly, deliberately. Each movement meant to prolong agony. It wasn't just pain that struck Wallace. It was a deep, unnatural wrongness. His insides were never meant to see daylight. Now they uncoiled like a glistening rope. The intestines slid from his body. 1 yard, then another and another. Each piece tossed into the burning brazier. The fire hissed as flesh met flame. This served more than just a practical role. It kept the platform clear, but also delivered a message. It was symbolic, the destruction of his inner self. The soul burned along with the body. In medieval thought, the bowels held courage. To burn them was to erase identity. The smell grew worse with every moment. Charred meat smoke and ruptured waste combined. The air was thick with death and fear. And Wallace could smell his own body cooking. His screams changed no longer words, just raw, piercing cries from deep within. Some said he still prayed aloud, calling to God and the Virgin Mary. Others believed he no longer spoke, only screamed in a language of pure suffering. What no one disputed was his awareness. He saw, felt, and knew every step. After the intestines came more organs. The liver, stomach, and spleen were removed. Each was shown to the crowd like trophies, then tossed into the ever-hungry flames. The kidneys were harder to reach. The executioner plunged his arms in deep. Blood and viscera covered him to the elbows. He worked without pause, like a butcher at market. Some claimed the heart came out still beating, but that's likely a legend, not science. Modern medicine tells a different story. The heart would have stopped from shock and blood loss. Still, Wallace had not yet died. His body kept fighting through the torment. Shock flooded his system, but slowly. He stayed alive longer than nature intended. Executioners of that time knew dark tricks. How to keep a victim conscious through agony. The table's slight tilt helped blood reach the brain, preventing a merciful blackout. The slow pace of organ removal prevented rapid bleeding and fast death. Wallace felt his body shutting down, a cold numbness spreading from hands and feet. His thirst grew unbearable. His body craved water, but his mouth could only scream. His mind was lost in confusion and horror. It tried to understand what was happening. Records say some victims survived 10 to 15 minutes. 10 minutes of watching their own insides burn. 10 minutes of pain beyond all words. 10 minutes of being torn from the inside out. The crowd began to change. Their cheers faded into stunned silence. Some walked away pale and trembling. Others looked down, unable to keep watching. The spectacle they had once cheered for now revealed a reality too dark to bear. Wallace's body began to fail. Even the skilled executioner couldn't stop it. His last remaining eye rolled back. Only the white remained, staring at nothing. His screams grew faint, fading into silence. Though his chest still moved, it was just reflex, not life. What made him his bravery. His spirit had retreated deep inside, ready for the end. Seeing the final moment draw near, the executioner stepped forward to finish the job. This next act needed a heavier blade and axe instead of the sharp knives used before. Malvis chose carefully, feeling the handle, testing the swing. He knew the last strike had to be done cleanly and with skill. A mistake here would ruin the event's end and damage the executioner's reputation. Wallace's broken form was dragged to the block. Some believe he recognized this as the closest thing to mercy. A heavy stillness swept over the crowd. They sensed that the bloody spectacle was nearly over. The executioner lifted the axe into the light, its polished edge flashing under the sun. For a breathless moment, everything stopped: the dying man, the raised weapon, the quiet crowd. Then the axe dropped, slicing through the air. Its impact echoed like meat being chopped. But the first blow didn't do the job. The body's position, or poor aim, left the neck partly intact. Wallace's body shook one last time, his nerves firing in a final burst of life. Embarrassed by the mistake, the executioner swung again. This time, the cut was clean, sharp, and final. He held up Wallace's head by the hair, turning in all directions for the crowd to see. "Here is the head of a traitor," he shouted, his voice ringing across Smithfield. Blood still dripped from the stump, and some claimed Wallace's lips still moved. Were they prayers, curses, or just dying muscles twitching? No one could say for sure. But death wasn't the end of the punishment. With Wallace finally beyond pain, the next step began. The quartering was brutal work, needing different tools. It wasn't wild hacking, it followed a method. The body was placed on a thick wooden slab. The axe was swapped for a cleaver built for the job. First, the arms were cut off at the shoulders, the blade cracking bone with wet, heavy sounds. Then came the legs, sliced off at the hips. Each limb was cleaned and wrapped for transport. The torso was then cut down the middle, dividing it into 4 equal parts. The assistants worked quickly and precisely, like trained butchers carrying out a grim duty. They caught the blood in buckets, handled the remains with ritual care, giving even state-sponsored killing a twisted sense of order. The audience began to drift away. Some walked off in silence, shaken by what they'd seen. Others chattered, comparing it to other public deaths. Children walked with their parents, told this was the fate of those who challenged the king. As the crowd thinned, sellers made their final pitches, trying to profit from the closing spectacle. Wallace's head received special treatment. It was boiled with herbs, a crude way to preserve it. The goal was to stop decay, but keep the face intact enough for display. Then the head was covered in tar for extra protection and mounted on a spike. By nightfall, it would hang from London Bridge, joining others who had dared to resist. The 4 body parts were also packed carefully. Salt preserved them, and barrels kept them sealed. One part was sent to Newcastle, a key English stronghold near Scotland. Another was sent to Berwick, a town Wallace had once freed from English rule. A third was sent to Stirling, where Wallace won his greatest victory. As for the 4th, records disagree. Some say it went to Perth, others to Aberdeen. But the message was always the same. Each major Scottish city would get a piece, a rotting warning from England, a display meant to crush the spirit of rebellion. But King Edward's plan didn't go as he hoped. Instead of killing the cause, he gave it a martyr. The very horror of Wallace's end turned him into something more powerful in death. The remains meant to frighten became sacred to those who still believed. Scots visited these body parts in secret, not with fear, but with admiration. They saw in Wallace a symbol of strength, a man who would not bow even in agony. Even Robert the Bruce, once an ally of the English, was said to be deeply moved by Wallace's death. Less than a year after Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce would rise once more. This time, his rebellion would not fail. When people asked him why he dared to face the same fate as Wallace, he is said to have answered, "I would rather die like Wallace than live as Edward's slave." The execution meant to crush hope had done the opposite. Instead of ending the fight for freedom, it had lit a fire no army could put out. The English chronicles, written by monks loyal to King Edward, tried to frame Wallace's death as justice from God. They listed his crimes against the church and painted him as a wild beast who deserved every lash and cut. But even in their biased words, something unexpected remained: a subtle admiration for Wallace's strength, a hidden discomfort with the way he died. Even his enemies, it seemed, felt that Edward had gone too far. Scottish sources, though, written later and fewer in number, told a different story. They described Wallace as noble to the very end. He did not plead, he did not beg, and he never betrayed his cause. The Chronicle of Walter Bower, written over 100 years later, claimed that Wallace spent his final breath in prayer, that he reached a spiritual peace even while his body was torn apart. We can't confirm these details, but they reveal something deeper, a longing to find meaning in the suffering of a national hero. Soon after his death, Scottish musicians began writing songs about Wallace. These were not heroic ballads, like the ones sung centuries later. They were raw, angry laments filled with grief and fury. They told of English cruelty and Scottish pain, and somehow they turned that pain into strength. The songs spread like wildfire. Traders, pilgrims, and farmers carried them to every village and valley. The English knew how dangerous these songs were. They outlawed them, punishing anyone caught singing about Wallace. But the ban only made the songs more powerful. They slipped underground, growing darker, bolder, more haunting. One surprising source of Wallace's legend came from English soldiers themselves, men who had watched the execution and gone home forever changed. They had expected to see a villain suffer and die. Instead, they witnessed a man face unthinkable torment without breaking. Whispers of his endurance spread from tavern to tavern. The monster became a martyr even to his enemies. This was more dangerous than any lie Edward could invent. Even the Scottish Church, once unsure about Wallace, changed its tune after his death. Priests who had once urged peace with England now called him a saint in sermons. They compared his suffering to that of Jesus Christ. His political death was transformed into a spiritual symbol. It was risky, but they understood the moment's power. Wallace's death united a divided nation with one shared emotion: rage. Even the display of his body parts did not have the effect the English wanted. His dismembered limbs were sent to towns as warnings. But instead of spreading fear, they became sacred sites. People traveled miles to see the remains of their fallen hero. Flowers and tokens were left in secret, even though it was forbidden. Wallace, even in pieces, inspired hope. The English found themselves in a trap of their own making. Removing the body parts would seem like retreat, but leaving them only fueled Scottish defiance. Eventually, the smell and decay forced their hand. The remains were quietly taken down and thrown away. Yet legends claimed loyal Scots had recovered and buried them. These stories, real or not, became part of his legacy. King Edward I died in 1307, just 2 years after Wallace. He spent his final days still fighting the rebellion he could never crush. On his deathbed, he supposedly ordered his bones to be carried into battle until Scotland was fully conquered. Even in death, he couldn't let go of his obsession. But his son Edward II lacked the same drive. The fight Wallace began, the dream he died for, lived on. And in 1314, Scotland struck a powerful blow at the Battle of Bannockburn. The legal precedent set by Wallace's trial left a shadow far beyond Scotland. Edward had labeled a foreign knight as a traitor to a crown he never served. This idea that rebellion equals treason, even outside your own borders, would be used again in Wales, Ireland, and later in America. Wallace's death became a dark lesson, a blueprint for how empires deal with those who dare to resist. Though the methods had evolved, the message stayed the same: obey without question or face total destruction. Not just the ending of your life, but the erasing of your humanity. But here's what the English rulers never understood. Sometimes becoming a martyr is the real victory. Wallace's shattered body did something his sword never could. It brought all of Scotland together, not through winning battles, but through the fire of shared outrage. Each Scot who heard the terrible details, who imagined his pain in those final moments, became more Scottish than before and less likely to ever surrender to English control. Wallace gave his people something more powerful than a victory. He gave them a wound that would never fully heal, one that would burn in the heart of every future generation. And that's what made him unforgettable. The records of Wallace's death were strangely detailed for that era. That tells us something important. The English knew they were making history. They carefully wrote down the charges, the court procedures, and even the horrific steps of the execution itself. They thought they were creating a story of law and justice being served. But in truth, they wrote a record of cold-blooded murder, a document that would accuse them for centuries to come. Modern scientists have studied how those brutal medieval executions worked, and the findings are terrifying. The method of hanging, drawing, and quartering was cruel, but also horribly efficient. Doctors now believe Wallace experienced something called neurogenic shock, a state where the brain is overwhelmed and the body's systems start to fail. But that didn't mean he blacked out. It meant he likely remained conscious, trapped in his body, watching the pain unfold from a strange distance. His mind likely retreated, seeking any mental place to survive. Historians have also studied the crowds at events like Wallace's execution. There was often a twisted sense of celebration, part festival, part horror show. People who were usually kind could join in the cruelty. The crowd became one violent mind and kindness disappeared. But Wallace's execution seemed to break that pattern. At certain moments, the silence was chilling. Some couldn't even watch, they turned away or walked off before the end. Even in an age of public cruelty, this was too much. From the moment his severed head was placed on London Bridge, Wallace began turning from man into legend. By the 1470s, when Blind Harry wrote The Wallace, the Real Man was already half myth. The stories added miracles, superhuman strength, and holy visions, not to deceive, but to match the scale of his sacrifice. The execution became the most important part of every retelling. Each version added more agony, more defiance, more spiritual power. Some said he sang psalms as his insides were burned. Others told of visions he saw in those final painful seconds. What mattered was the message: his suffering had become sacred. To the English, he was a criminal. To the Scots, a holy martyr. Wallace's words at his trial were simple but revolutionary. He said, "I cannot be a traitor. I never swore loyalty to that king." That one line would echo through history. It planted the seed that true authority must be chosen, not forced with swords. Wallace probably didn't mean to write philosophy, but in that moment he did, and generations of rebels and thinkers would take strength from those words. The brutal details of his execution weren't just for shock value. They served a message carved into his flesh. They showed how far the powerful would go to crush anyone who dared to stand up. His ruined body was meant to be a warning, but instead it became a lesson in courage. It taught future rebels just how brave one must be, and it showed that fear, no matter how terrifying, could never truly rule forever. As time passed, each era gave Wallace new meaning. During the Protestant Reformation, he became a symbol of holy resistance. During the Enlightenment, he stood for freedom and logic against tyranny. For Romantic nationalists, he was the soul of Scotland, noble, passionate, crushed by greed. Each generation looked at his broken body and saw their own struggle in it. And the places tied to his death became more than historic sites. They became sacred ground where memory and resistance would never die. London Bridge, where his head was displayed, remained a painful symbol of English rule for centuries. Even long after the bridge was gone, its memory haunted Scottish culture like a scar. Smithfield, the place where he was executed, became known as Cursed Ground, a site where English violence had crossed a sacred line. Westminster Hall, where his unfair trial took place, was remembered not as a court of justice, but as a courtroom stained with murder. These places weren't just names on a map. They anchored Wallace's story in real solid ground. And because of that, his tale couldn't be brushed off as just old folklore. What never changes across all the retellings is the moment of his death. No matter how the story is retold or romanticized, his brutal execution refuses to be softened. The method, hanging, drawing, and quartering was too precise, too shocking, and too real to ignore. Even the most poetic versions of his story must face the truth of what Wallace endured. His suffering keeps his legend rooted in history. It's not fantasy, it's fact. The English records especially, one new discovery say more than they meant to. An old pipe roll, a financial document, carefully listed the cost of Wallace's execution. It noted every charge, every item used, and where each part of his body was sent. This wasn't just routine bookkeeping. It shows the English knew they were making history. They wanted a performance, a warning for all rebels. And yes, they made history. Just not the kind they intended. They built a legend, not a lesson in fear. One man who couldn't forget Wallace was Robert the Bruce. He had once helped the English and even hunted Wallace down. Watching Wallace suffer must have filled him with unbearable guilt and shame. Some say Bruce's later rebellion was his way of trying to make things right, that Wallace's death transformed him from a cautious ally into a true freedom fighter. The method of Wallace's execution would spark outrage for generations. As people began to talk about human rights, his death became proof of state cruelty. Philosophers and reformers pointed to Wallace when calling for an end to torture. Even those who supported the death penalty argued it should never involve public agony like his. In the end, the final irony couldn't be greater. The English tried to erase Wallace, but they made him immortal. Had he died quietly in prison or fallen in battle, he might have become a footnote in history. But the nightmare of his public death turned him into something far bigger. It made him a legend that outlasted even the monarchy that tried to silence him. 7 centuries have passed, yet Wallace's death still speaks to the world today. His executioners thought they were killing a traitor. What they created was a symbol of undying courage. His suffering became a torch for others to follow. His final words still ring with power. True power must come with consent, and freedom is worth the highest price. William Wallace may have been torn apart, but his legacy remains whole, stronger than ever. His death wasn't just an end. It was the beginning of a legend that still inspires the fight for freedom today. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about history, don't let it stop here. Share this video to keep his memory alive. Leave a like if you believe some things are worth standing for, no matter the cost. And subscribe to our channel for more untold truths from the shadows of the past. Because history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about people, courage, and the price of defiance.